You are going to die. Not this very moment, some in a few days, some in a few months, some in a few years. I'm here to tell you some good news and some bad news. What do you want to hear first? Bad news? Bad news is that you have a disease that's killing you. You can give it to others. The good news, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Wait, you said I had some good news. Now that is never good news. Hello, inquisitive minds. The contents of this video are best listened to or viewed during the day, not before bed. I am the Brandon AF, and I am presenting you with the Government Confession series. Welcome to the Dark Truths. You're going to learn something new, and you may or may not feel good about it. This is not a feel-good story, but one of facts. You see, this doesn't have a happy ending. In fact, the nefarious acts of the government was so blatant and bad, an active president of the United States apologized publicly. But there's a kicker, and you're not going to believe it. Have a seat. Have you ever had a feeling where you're seeing something and it's supposed to be the first time? It's not though. You've seen it before. Actually, you're certain you've seen it a few times. Deep in your mind's eye, you search and you can't quite put your finger on it, but you're certain. And then it hits. It hits so hard that you start to sweat. Let me know in the comments if you get that feeling at the conclusion of this episode of Dark Truths. While we're at it, the next episode in this series is going to leave you shaken. If you like this type of content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. It's 1932 and we're in the middle of the Great Depression. To paint a landscape, the Great Depression was so much worse than it sounds. The worst economic situation the world has ever seen. It forced couples to delay marriage. It drove birth rate below the replacement level for the first time in American history. Here's an example of how bad it was. From 1930 until 1960, the most popular female contraceptive was Lysol disinfectant, advertised as a feminine hygiene product. Even small finances were nearly impossible to stop that genetically wired sexual instinct from taking over, and Lysol disinfectant was used as a form of birth control. In fact, conditions were so bad, the divorce rate fell. The reason for this was simple. Many couples could not afford to maintain separate households or pay legal fees. They just stuck it out with the ones they couldn't stand. Imagine. From 1932 all the way to 1972, an unethical experiment that would result in countless deaths was being conducted purposely and knowingly on over 600 men that were lied to by the U.S. Public Health Service, also known as US PHS, which we'll refer to as PHS going forward, and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, also known as CDC. Yes, that CDC. 40 years this went on. Get this. During that time, there was a cure. This cure was never given to the patients. Why? A cured patient from a disease wouldn't allow the PHS or the CDC to gain the same level of information than if the disease was allowed to grow and be studied. The PHS and the CDC needed these men to die so autopsies could be performed. Now, the official story somewhat varies in details, as you can imagine, with the actual events. It's no surprise, not directly related to this experiment, but did you know that between 1945 in 1956, thousands of orphans, soldiers, mental health patients, prisoners, and sex workers in Guatemala were deliberately infected with syphilis and gonorrhea by American doctors under the order of the United States. Many died and countless others were infected as they spread this disease, including to their children, who would also die untreated. It would seem this level of subhuman treatment warrants scrutinizing these organizations about their interpretation of actual events, while also being extremely and somewhat stranger familiar feeling, if you know what I mean. As the story continues, and it will get worse, official records note that the initial number of men being experimented on, 399 to start with, at first had already contracted the disease. A few hundred more in this experiment had not. Of the entire group, every one of these test subjects were sharecroppers, who the US government refers to affectionately as Negro males. Yes, it is truly getting worse. So why? The purpose of the study was to observe the natural history of untreated syphilis. This experiment being driven by the United States government and the Tuskegee University, then Tuskegee Institute, a historically black college in Alabama, consisted of nothing but impoverished African-American sharecroppers from Macon County, Alabama. Of these black men, 399 had latent syphilis, with a control group of 201 who were not infected. A history that's ever continuous repetition, like right now, a lot of the world feels like Rome, but with Wi-Fi. We're not going to be giving the PHS or the CDC the benefit of the doubt here, since this experiment was their direct initiative. So how do these men become part of this experiment? Well, that has to do with fear. At the worst economic time in the world's history, these impoverished men were, as an incentive for participation in this study experiment, were promised free medical care but were deceived by the PHS and CDC, who never informed their subjects of their diagnosis and disguised placebos, ineffective methods, and diagnostic procedures as treatment. Things are about to get really bad, so buckle up. The men were initially told that this experiment was going to last only 6 months, but it extended 40 years. After funding was lost, the study continued without informing the men that they would never be treated. That was the goal the entire time, as you'll learn soon enough. None of the infected men was treated with penicillin, despite the fact by 1947 the antibiotic was widely available and had become standard treatment for the disease. This entire time, these men would come face to face with the following problems. On purpose: brain and neurological problems, stroke, infection and inflammation of membranes around the brain and spinal cord, numbness, deafness, visual problems or blindness, personality changes, dementia, heart and valve disease, aneurysms, inflammation of blood vessels, death. Fast forward 40 years and how we came to know this. In 1972, when a leak to the press resulted in its termination on November 16th of that year, by then, 28 patients had died directly from syphilis. 100 died from complications related to syphilis. 40 of the patients' wives were infected, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. It doesn't cover who the disease was spread to and how many died that way. It's obvious major violation of ethical standards and has been cited as arguably the most infamous biomedical research study in US history. Well, some might say until end of 2020, 2021, but I digress. Its revelation led to the 1979 Belmont Report and to the establishment of the Office of Human Research Protections, that's OHRP, and federal laws and regulations requiring institutional review boards for protection of human subjects and studies. The OHRP manages this responsibility within the United States Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. Its revelation has been an important cause of distrust in medical science and the US government amongst African Americans. Understandably, I would make a point to include this should be a major concern of distrust for all Americans because as an American, we are one people. I would also point out that a government body governing a government body that was the sole reason for this experiment shouldn't keep us warm and fuzzy and feeling safe. That would be the equivalent of a police officer giving themselves a ticket for speeding after the police chief told them to speed and then not to give themselves a ticket. So why did the government decide to sacrifice these men? Pure evil is the bottom line. The Public Health Service, whose primary mission is the protection, promotion, and advancement of health and safety of the general public, ironically, reasoned that they were not harming the men involved in the study under the presumption that they were unlikely to receive any treatment ever. That proves to be wrong, as you'll learn here in a little bit. The entire purpose of this experiment was to observe the natural course of this untreated disease. Study clinicians could have chosen to treat all subjects and close the study or split off a control group for testing with penicillin. Instead, they continued the study without treating any of the participants. They withheld treatment and information about the cure penicillin from the subjects. In addition, scientists prevented participants from accessing treatment programs available to other residents in the area, directly blocking any care, which is the exact criteria that was promised as far as being a participant in this, as they called, study. Now, by area, I mean less impoverished areas, if you know what I mean. The government reasoned that the knowledge gained would benefit mankind. What does that sound like? The study was characterized as the longest non-therapeutic experiment on human beings in medical history. Now imagine if an experiment like this took place on a global scale, one that required you to waive all liability to either the pharmaceutical company, the government, work, ultimately releasing them of all responsibility. And the promise isn't just for medical care, it's for humanity. It's so you could keep your job, so you can it's awful. Let's just stop there. It sounds like something that could happen in a book about a dystopian future in 1984, except maybe the year's wrong. How did this continue? To ensure the men would show up for the possibly dangerous, extremely painful diagnostic non-therapeutic spinal taps, doctors sent participants misleading letters titled "Last Chance for Special Free Treatment." Now these crimes weren't even the worst. During World War II, 256 infected subjects registered for the draft and were consequently diagnosed as having syphilis at military induction centers in order to obtain treatment before they could be taken to armed services. PHS researchers prevented these men from getting treatment, thus depriving them the chance of a cure It was literally argued this study is of great importance from a scientific standpoint. It represents one of the last opportunities which the science of medicine will have to conduct an investigation of this kind. Dr. Smith asked that these men be excluded from the list of draftees needing treatment in order to make it possible to continue the study on an effective basis, knowing it would result in a death sentence. Let this sink in. These men were enlisting knowing they would be risking their lives for the freedoms of Americans, and they were denied a simple penicillin treatment for a disease so they could be studied and ultimately suffer an excruciating death. Giving their lives to the American people and to the government wasn't enough, you see. Their lives, unbeknownst to them, was already the government's, and they would do what they pleased with it. Later, Dr. Smith, a local PHS representative involved in the study, wrote asking what should be done with the patients who had tested negative for syphilis at the time of enrollment in the study and were being used as control subjects, but had later tested positive when registering for the draft. He wrote, "So far, we are keeping the known positive patients from getting treatment. Is a control case of any value to the study if he has contracted syphilis? Shall we withhold treatment from the control case who has developed syphilis?" The reply was such cases have lost their value to the study. There is no reason why these patients should not be given appropriate treatment unless you hear from Dr. Ebert, who was in direct charge of the study. By 1947, penicillin had become the standard therapy for this disease. The U.S. government sponsored several public health programs to form rapid treatment centers to eradicate the disease. When campaigns to eradicate venereal disease came to Macon County, the government prevented their subjects from participating. Yes, they stopped these men from participating in these programs that they were literally bringing there to stop this disease. Although some of the men in the study received penicillin treatments elsewhere, most of them this did not amount to adequate therapy. And here's the beauty in that sarcasm. Here comes Nurse Rivers, who had trained at the institute and worked at the hospital, was recruited at the start of the study to be the main point of contact with the participants. Rivers played a crucial role in the study because she served as a direct link to the regional African American community. Her participation was key to gaining the trust of the subjects and promoting their participation. As part of Miss Rivers' lodge, participants would receive free physical examinations at the university, free rides to and from the clinics, hot meals on examination days, and free treatment for minor ailments, all for the small fee of their life and her soul. Rivers was also key in convincing families to sign autopsy agreements in return for funeral benefits. As the study became long-term, Rivers became the chief person who provided continuity to the participants. She was the only study staff person to work with participants for the full 40 years. I know this seems like it's all bad news, but the good news is she would eventually be rewarded with a special place in hell. Now, there were some heroes, and their names should be remembered. Several men employed by the PHS, namely Austin V. Deaver and Austin P. Ishrant, expressed criticism on the study on the grounds of immorality and poor scientific practice. You think? The first dissenter against the study who was not involved in PHS was Count Gibson, who was an associate professor at the Medical College of Virginia in Richmond. Now, he expressed his ethical concerns to PHS's Sidney Lansky in 1955. Like today, for medical professionals to speak up against the narrative, despite scientific medical proof backing the science and their stance, proof that they provide, they become ridiculed or silenced, and it can become a career-destroying endeavor. Discarding the medical and scientific data, morals do not matter, especially when evil is at work. So things are bad at this point. Another dissenter was Irwin Shantz, a young Chicago doctor only 4 years out of medical school. In 1965, he read an article about the study. Now here's the thing, this is going on and they're publishing this and people are reading these studies and nobody's doing anything about it. After reading the study in a medical journal, he wrote a letter directly to the study's authors, confronting them with a declaration of brazen unethical practice. His letter was read by Ann R. Yobbs, one of the study's authors, was immediately ignored and filed away with a brief memo that no reply would be sent. Ann's eventual death won't look good for her eternity. Now let me introduce an alpha stud muffin, Peter Buxton, PHS venereal disease investigator in San Francisco. Now this dude's a stud, a man of the people. In 1966, he sent a letter to the National Director of the Division of Venereal Diseases expressing his concerns about the ethics and morality of the extended U.S. Public Health Service's syphilis study. The CDC, which by then controlled the study, reaffirmed the need to continue the study until completion. That meant until all participants, subjects, experimentees had died and been autopsied. To bolster its position, the CDC received unequivocal support for the continuation of the study both from local chapters of the National Medical Association, representing African American physicians, and the American Medical Association, the AMA. Ask the AMA how their unequivocal support for lobotomies aged. Taking a chunk out of your brain in hopes that you would no longer be depressed, fear of aging, be a homosexual. If the medical community considers becoming a vegetable after a procedure a success, they still have no business being part of humanity. Our boy Peter, a man of the people, finally went to the press in the early 70s. The story broke first in the Washington Star on July 25th, 72. Reported by Gene Heller of the Associated Press, it became front page news in the New York Times the following day. Senator Edward Kennedy called congressional hearings at which Peter and HEW officials testified. As a result of the public outcry, the CDC and PHS appointed an ad hoc advisory panel to review the study. The panel found that the men agreed to certain terms of the experiment, such as examination and treatment. However, they were not informed of the study's actual purpose, which was to let the disease run its course until death and an autopsy could be performed. Imagine the CDC not giving the accurate information to an ad hoc advisory panel. Does this sound familiar? The aftermath looked like this. 74 Congress passed the National Research Act and created a commission to study and write regulations governing studies involving human participants. Within the United States Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Human Research Protections, OHRP, was established to oversee clinical trials. If a person was to look at current events, clinical studies, and experimental drugs or treatments, this may feel a bit terrifying, and it should. And the lives that were stolen went completely unpunished. Now, studies require informed consent, communication of diagnosis, and accurate reporting of test results. But do they? Institutional review boards, including lay people, are established in scientific research groups and hospitals to review study protocols, protect patient interests, and ensure that participants are fully informed. I hope that's not like one of those end-user license agreements that you have to scroll through 500 pages and accept before you can get into your new electronic device, because that's all legal jargon. Most people don't really understand that. Now get this. In 1994, a multidisciplinary symposium was held at the U.S. Public Health Service's Syphilis Study. They named it Doing Bad in the Name of Good. This symposium was held at the University of Virginia. Following that, interested parties formed a study legacy committee to develop ideas that had arisen at the symposium. It issued its final report in May 1996, having been established at the meeting on January 18th and 19th of that year. The committee had two related goals. One, President Bill Clinton should publicly apologize to the survivors of their community for past government wrongdoing and fears of the government and medical abuse the study created among African Americans. No apology had yet been issued. Two, the committee and relevant federal agencies should develop a strategy to redress the damages, specifically recommending the creation of a center for public education, training programs for healthcare providers, and a center for the study of ethics and scientific research. A year later, on May 16, 1997, Bill Clinton formally apologized and held a ceremony at the White House for all 5 surviving participants.
I would like to recognize the other survivors who are here today and their families. Mr. Charlie Pollard is here. Mr. Carter Howard. Mr. Fred Simmons. Mr. Simmons just took his first airplane ride. He reckons he's about 110 years old, so I think it's time for him to take a chance or two.
The timing of this joke is brutal because he did take some chances. One, trusting the government, almost got him killed.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, all of you. I would also like to ask 3 family representatives who are here. Sam Donor is represented by his daughter, Gwendolyn Cox. Thank you, Gwendolyn. Ernest Hendon, who is watching in Tuskegee, is represented by his brother, North Hendon. Thank you, sir, for being here. And George Key is represented by his grandson, Christopher Monroe. Thank you, Chris. I also acknowledge the families, community leaders, teachers, and students watching today by satellite from Tuskegee. The White House is the people's house. We are glad to have all of you here today. I thank Dr. David Satcher for his role in this. I thank Congresswoman Waters and Congressman Hilliard, Congressman Stokes, the entire Congressional Black Caucus, Dr. Satcher, members of the cabinet who are here, Secretary Herman, Secretary Slater, a great friend of freedom, Fred Gray, thank you for fighting this long battle for all these long years. The 8 men who are survivors of the syphilis study at Tuskegee are a living link to a time not so very long ago that many Americans would prefer not to remember, but we dare not forget. It was a time when our nation failed to live up to its ideals, when our nation broke the trust with our people that is the very foundation of our democracy. It is not only in remembering that shameful past that we can make amends and repair our nation, but it is in remembering that past that we can build a better present and a better future. And without remembering it, we cannot make amends and we cannot go forward. So today, America does remember the hundreds of men used in research without their knowledge and consent. We remember them and their family members. Men who were poor and African American, without resources and with few alternatives. They believed they had found hope when they were offered free medical care by the United States Public Health Service. They were betrayed. Medical people are supposed to help when we need care, but even once a cure was discovered, they were denied help and they were lied to by their government. Our government is supposed to protect the rights of its citizens. Their rights were trampled upon. 40 years, hundreds of men betrayed, along with their wives and children, along with a community in Macon County, Alabama, the city of Tuskegee, the fine university there, and the larger African American community. The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It was an outrage to our commitment to integrity and equality for all our citizens. To the survivors, to the wives and family members, the children and the grandchildren, I say what you know. No power on earth can give you back the lives lost, the pain suffered, the years of internal torment and anguish. What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry. To our African American citizens, I am sorry that your federal government orchestrated a study so clearly racist.
Let's continue the conversation below. What are your thoughts on the PHS and CDC knowingly lying, manipulating, and ultimately killing these men? They took their lives, they shaped their lives. These lives were never these men's. They could have given them a cure at any time. Thank you for coming by the channel. I hope you learned something new, and we'll see you soon for the next episode of Dark Truths.